for joining today. I hope to be able to raise some points that are of interest to you and to give you some more moments for pause and for thought. And as Damien said, very happy to take questions, either during the presentation or at the end. I will try to keep an eye on the chat box, and I think Damien will do so as well. I think questions are always quite useful because particularly when we try and think about what the impact is of regulatory developments on us here in Africa, actually debating it and talking it through is where we get most of the value. So please do raise questions as I go. So yes, as Damien said, I'm a director in the Banking and Finance Department at ENS, and I'm also a member of the ESG practice group within our firm. The group is a multidisciplinary group that's made up of experts from our various departments. And the reason for that is that we try to work together collaboratively to ensure that we're exploring all dimensions of the implications of these regulatory developments, particularly in this field, across all the different sectors, disciplines, and throughout Africa. So I've got a slide here, which I'm going to try and flip through and not mess it up. There we go. So as you can see, we've got offices in 7 jurisdictions throughout Africa, and where we're not on the ground, we do have a correspondent network in those jurisdictions. And that helps us to really think of these issues and try to think of these issues from a context-specific perspective. I, of course, am sitting in South Africa, and I'm a South African qualified lawyer. I'm also a banking and finance lawyer, so my perspective is perhaps a bit skewed towards sustainable finance in South Africa. So apologies for the slightly heavy South African bent and also financial services bent to this presentation. If you do have any questions, though, on any of the other jurisdictions, or you'd like me to put you in contact with one of my colleagues specializing in those jurisdictions, please do just get in touch with me. My contact details are on the screen, and I will certainly connect you. So when it comes to ESG development across the continent, we believe that our context in the global south is very important. And we aim, when advising our clients, to provide advice that takes this into account while appreciating the unique intersectionality and challenge that we face as a continent, grappling with inevitable change and historical baggage. And I think that's quite important. I was speaking to a bank in Uganda about ESG a couple of weeks ago, and at the end of the presentation, one of the bankers said, but really, when we think of the GHG emissions per capita in Africa compared to the GHG emissions per capita in the US, why are we actually having this discussion here? And why are we talking so much about decarbonization in the context of a continent where the focus could arguably be required to be on growth in order to meet the SDGs? So the context is really important. What I want to do today is to touch on some of the international developments, so not actually talk about specific jurisdictional developments only within Africa, but I'd like to talk about some international developments that we as a firm have been watching for our African clients and hopefully position those from our perspective here in Africa. Because even though these developments are taking place outside of Africa, they obviously have the ability to have a profound impact on our economies and our people. So it's important for us to understand what those developments are and to be ready to see the ripples and the influence that those developments will exert on us. So that's essentially the outline of what I'd like to try to do today. But before I get there, maybe just to put this into context, I've given a couple talks on ESG over the last sort of 2-3 years or so. And in some of those talks, I've had to start with what is ESG. And in other of those talks, I've had to try and convince the audience that this is something that we should all be concerned about and not something that's merely of import to a marketing department or to a consumer-facing department within a particular corporate. But when we look at the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report from 2023, from this year, and you can see there that in the short term, on the 2-year trajectory and on the 10-year trajectory, the kinds of risks that are keeping the world up at night. I think it's important to start here because it underscores that this is more than just trend or more than even just regulation. It is actually a fundamental threat to our existence as we know it. And so when I, as a lawyer, and when the firm in our practice group, when we think about these issues, we try to think about it, again, taking into account the fact that it's not a superficial inquiry. And when we think of the regulation and we talk to clients about how to deal with regulatory trends and developments, it's not the case that we're looking for ways to tick compliance boxes as quickly and easily as possible, but rather we're looking at ways of embracing the changes which we are experiencing, seeking solutions to the problems, the new problems that are emerging, and seeking ways to do things better and in a more sustainable way. So just to put Africa in context for those of you who haven't seen these statistics before, although some of you may already have, Africa represents 7% of the current global population, but is responsible historically for 3% of the cumulative worldwide CO2 emissions. So I'm not sure if any of you have seen that graphic, and I probably should have included it, of the carbon budget and how much of the carbon budget has been used up already through historical emissions. And that graphic is chilling because it reminds us that we have only a small slice of the pie left in terms of carbon budget still to use up. And if you think of that graphic then against the fact that Africa has only contributed 3% of that, you can understand why there's frustration among policymakers, governments, and corporates on the continent when they hear constant messaging around decarbonization and the need to move away from carbon-intensive industry, albeit that might be the industry most necessary for economic growth. However, this, of course, leads to climate injustice, and whilst that may be so, it doesn't, the fact that Africa has contributed so little to the cumulative worldwide CO2 emissions does not protect Africa from the effects, and we are likely to experience climate change and extreme weather events disproportionately across Africa, as we have already started doing. And that is an important driver for the need to start taking action, whether to adapt or mitigate, and the need to ensure that capital allocations are driven in the correct direction, even if only to prepare for the inevitable events that we are likely to experience on the continent. We are already vulnerable. That statistic is always quite shocking to me when we think that 30 million people in Africa were pushed into extreme poverty and 22 million jobs lost just due to the pandemic. It shows the vulnerability that we as a continent have to these stresses, such as the pandemic, or to climatic events or extreme weather events. Generally, across the continent, 46% share of fossil-based energy sources in the energy mix in 2020. Of course, South Africa is an outlier with very coal-intensive driven energy sector, but otherwise countries such as Kenya, for example, already have a very renewable based energy sector. So as I've said, we need to think about this from the context of Africa, and that is certainly something that we strive to do. So let me turn to the international developments relevant to Africa that I'd like to touch on today. This is just a bit of a agenda for you. So I'll talk briefly about the ISSB Sustainability Disclosure Standards. I'll touch on the Global Framework on Biodiversity, the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which recommendations are actually being published at New York Climate Week today and tomorrow, the CSRD and the CSSD in Europe and what the effect of that is, and then finally talking about CBAM. And as I said, I'm going to try and bring these regulatory developments home within the context of Africa. Okay, so as we know, in June this year, the International Sustainability Standards Board issued IFRS S1, which is the general requirements for disclosure of sustainability-related financial information, and IFRS S2, climate-related disclosures. So these are effective for the annual reporting periods beginning next year or on or after 1 Jan 2024, but earlier application is permitted. So why is this important? IFRS obviously cannot require companies to comply with these standards, but these standards represent a very important international benchmark, and they're likely to form the basis of domestic legislation requiring compliance by companies in country. And I think the most important aspect of these standards and why their issuance was such a watershed moment is that they consolidate the myriad voluntary reporting and disclosure requirements that are currently in the global market relating to ESG considerations. So they represent the opportunity for an improvement in consistency of disclosure and reporting. And that in itself sets the scene for regulators to better manage the systemic risk posed by climate change and biodiversity loss, and to guard against the associated market conduct risk. In the UK, for example, the government has recently announced plans to develop its own IFRS-based reporting standard, and that would form the basis ultimately for the need for future legislation to require mandatory reporting. In South Africa, towards the end of last year, 2 years ago, December 2021, the JSE issued sustainability and climate disclosure guidance. And that was an earlier attempt. So it was obviously before the ISSB had issued IFRS S1 and S2, but it was an attempt to draw together the various international standards available. And it was based on the exposure drafts for S1 and S2. So it has taken the substance of those into account as well. And the JSE's guidance, as it was published, sought to provide a benchmark that is based on international best practice, but also takes into account the South African specific context. And it was published as voluntary guidance, but it signaled for us, at least in South Africa, a move towards consistent and mandatory disclosure regulation, because the minute you have convergence and consistency, you're more likely to be able to move to a mandatory regime. So what is very interesting about looking at the specific content of what the disclosure is that's required under the JSE sustainability and climate disclosure is it goes to it sets out in great granular detail based on the best of breed from all of the different international voluntary standards, what the content is that would need to be disclosed. And that can give a good indication to companies as to where we may go when we get to mandatory regulation or mandatory reporting regulation. So again, interesting that's driven by stock exchanges. So in the UK, the FCA, for example, already requires certain UK listed companies to comply with TCFD recommendations in respect of climate related disclosure from a listing perspective. And of course, similar regulation is being mooted by the SEC in the US. In Ghana, the GSE encourages reporting in line with the GRI, requiring some mandatory disclosure, but encouraging listed companies to undertake further additional reporting in line with ESG factors on a voluntary basis. And I think one of the issues we face as a region is that the developments in Africa are not uniform. So we've spoken about what's happening in Ghana, and we've spoken about South Africa. If we look at Namibia, for example, the NSX, the exchange there, issued a directive in 2022 requiring the establishment by listed companies of an SES committee. So that's a Social, Ethics and Sustainability Committee. Now that committee closely resembles what is required of certain companies in South Africa. So it's a similar type of committee, and it's tasked with ensuring that ESG factors are integrated into business operations and that there is adequate oversight and reporting. So this is certainly positive, the step in the right direction, but having such a committee in and of itself does not lead without more to the level of transparency that's required for the market to be able to truly take sustainability into account. So it's a regulatory development in the right direction, but it's not yet bringing about this disclosures and reporting on a basis that is transparent enough and comparable enough to really drive capital allocation. And if we think about it from a regulator's point of view, and certainly our regulator, the FSCA in South Africa, has recently put out statements on sustainable finance, and they've made this point as well, is that comparable disclosure is necessary And in the absence of comparable disclosure, then a regulator needs to be concerned about mis-selling or the lack of transparency for financial consumers, greenwashing, and associated market conduct risks. And those are some of the risks that the South African regulator has raised, particularly underscoring the market conduct risk associated with ESG and the need to ensure that customers are treated fairly, and that those TCF principles, which are the bedrock of our market conduct regulation in South Africa, that those are taken into account when we think about ESG regulation. So what are the takeaways for Africa, or for us in Africa, from the issuance of IFRS S1 and S2? So they provide a convergence, as I said, of the previously disparate reporting regimes, and this makes it easier for regulators and exchanges to require mandatory disclosure against these standards. So this is an important step for all jurisdictions in moving towards mandatory disclosure. They also represent the best of breed. So IFRS S1 requires an entity to disclose information about its sustainability-related risks and opportunities, and S2 requires disclosure of information about climate-related risks and opportunities. The disclosures must be useful to users of general purpose financial reports in making decisions relating to providing resources to that entity. The disclosures must go to the entity's governance, its strategy, its processes, including its risk management, and its performance against the targets which it set. The types or risks and opportunities to be disclosed are those which are reasonably expected to affect the cash flow of the entity, its access to finance, or cost of capital over the short, the medium, or the long term. And S2 then breaks the climate-related risks to which an entity is exposed down into either climate-related physical risks, climate-related transition risks, and climate-related opportunities. And that's a very similar breakup of risks to what we've seen our National Treasury do in South Africa when Treasury talks about the climate-related risks facing financial institutions. So why is this relevant? So it's relevant because it provides an opportunity for African companies to undertake a gap analysis between their current disclosures, the ones that they may be making in accordance with the voluntary standards that already exist, or that they may be making in terms of certain voluntary standards that are in-country specific or are driven by an exchange, for example. So companies on the continent can undertake this gap analysis, and this will help to identify or to highlight the areas where work may be required, either work to processes or areas or business as usual that needs to change, processes that need to be updated to be able to generate the data that is necessary to make the disclosures at this new benchmark level, and where governance arrangements need reimagining, and importantly, where capacity building is required. What's also important about the IFRS S1 and S2 is that, as we know from an accounting standards perspective, 140 countries already require their domestic companies to adhere to the IFRS accounting standards. So if we see this level of adoption around IFRS S1 and S2, then we will see a more standardized convergence on such a level that it will make a big difference to the way in which companies undertake business so as to be able to report. The next important international development or global development that I think has an impact on us here in Africa, and I see there've been some questions, so I will get to those as soon as I've got through these sections, is the Kunming-Montreal Global Framework on Biodiversity. So this framework, as we know, was adopted at the end of COP15 in December last year, and it acknowledges the precarious position that we are in as a global community, experiencing a dangerous decline in nature, which poses a threat not only to businesses reliant on ecosystem services, but also to our very existence. The framework, as we know, seeks to halt nature loss, setting 23 action-oriented global targets to be met by 2030 to ensure that we safeguard and only sustainably use biodiversity. And then it also, of course, has further long-term goals set for 2050. So most of us will have heard of the, the 30 by 30 target, which aims to ensure the conservation and protection of 30% of both land and sea by 2030. But from a lawyer's perspective and from a regulatory perspective, target 15 is especially important. And this target requires countries to take legal, administrative, or policy measures to encourage and enable business, and in particular, to ensure that large and transnational companies and financial institutions actually transparently disclose their risks, dependencies, and impacts on biodiversity. So essentially what we were talking about in terms of sustainability related and climate related disclosures and risks, target 15 of the GBF requires there to be a policy intervention in country in order to require companies to actually monitor and disclose both their dependencies and their impacts on biodiversity. And what is the takeaway from that? What does that mean for all of us? It means that African countries will be considering their own national policies to ensure alignment with the global biodiversity framework targets. And that may entail considering what changes need to be made to the regulatory regime to ensure that both dependencies and impact are disclosed. South Africa at the end of last month has just published the updated National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, which seeks to articulate our country's policy in this regard and to align with the narrative of conservation and restoration that's found in the GBF. But Target 15, I think, is also important because it can potentially drive, and I think it will drive, financial innovation in the form of nature-positive financial products. And we're likely to see an increase as companies start to grapple with disclosure requirements, requiring them to disclose their nature dependencies and impacts. Already, if we just go back to the JSE sustainability disclosure guidance that I mentioned a bit earlier, there is a row of the narrative disclosure which requires a company who's obviously chosen voluntarily to adopt that guidance, but a company would be required to disclose what impact it has on key biodiversity areas. And it would be required to disclose what amount it is or what efforts it's making to ameliorate the impact which it has. Now, as disclosure relating to nature impact and nature dependency becomes mandatory, as the Global Biodiversity Framework anticipates it will, this could be a push factor for companies to invest in instruments that allow them to show with integrity that they are investing in the conservation or protection of biodiversity. And so I think related to that, we're seeing a lot of activity around things like biodiversity credits and the development of financial products that can demonstrate positive nature outcomes. So there have been projects so far in Namibia and South Africa and Uganda looking at ways to track the data from the nature positive activities being undertaken and linking that outcome, that positive outcome, to the capital flow that's been invested in that particular product. And that in itself will lead to further regulatory development in our jurisdictions as regulators consider whether those products, certificates, units, credits, whatever one may call them, whether those constitute financial products or not, and how those instruments should be regulated. Another aspect flowing from the GBF from Africa's perspective is that, of course, the biodiversity of Africa is an asset which we need to protect and which is likely to attract funding from offshore investors. Hopefully will attract funding from offshore investors because the GBF, of course, makes it starkly clear that there is a very large funding gap necessary to ensure that we actually do conserve and protect biodiversity to the degree necessary to meet the targets of the GBF. So Africa's biodiversity potential is, of course, an opportunity which can be harnessed and which, again, regulators will need to consider how this can best be done. Of course, another important aspect of this is the equitable benefit sharing principle to ensure that Indigenous communities who have long been the custodians of remaining biodiverse places are included in the benefits flowing from that. Moving to the task force on nature-related financial disclosures. And as I said, the final recommendations are being published as we speak over the next 2 days at New York Climate Week. These disclosures complement Target 15 that we were just discussing in the context of the GBF, and they require companies to provide transparency again as to their impact and dependency of their operations on nature. And this disclosure or this information is what the market needs to make informed investment decisions. So as the market begins to appreciate and analyze nature-related risk more accurately, that insight into that further information that will become available, we're likely to see a move towards nature-positive investment and away from nature-destructive investment. The TNFD represents the primary global framework for the assessment of nature-related risks and opportunities, and its recommendations will certainly shape corporate disclosures on nature in the coming decade. An interesting aspect of this to consider is whether, so we've already seen in jurisprudence over the last sort of few years or so, the development of the fiduciary duty of directors to take sustainability risks or factors into account. And arguably, this extends to include the responsibility within that fiduciary duty. Certainly in South Africa, we argue that it does, to take, for example, dependency on nature into account. And a failure to do so could potentially be falling short of a fiduciary duty. This will become more pertinent as these disclosures are made. Similarly, again, the trend toward requiring, I don't like to call it a trend, but the development toward requiring the integration of E, S, and G factors into investment making process, this will further be enhanced by the need to take nature positive factors into account. In South Africa, to use a South African example, Regulation 28, which is the regulation pertaining to our registered pension funds, requires pension fund trustees to take ESG factors into account. And this has been the case since 2011. And essentially, what trustees need to do is to acknowledge to integrate the E, the S, and the G factors when making investment decisions, and to build this into their investment policy statement. And essentially, the requirement, putting this in the regulation and requiring this of pension fund trustees, is essentially an acknowledgement of the impact on the sustainability of investments for the longer term horizon that these factors can have. And this is, again, something that there's been debate in our jurisdiction around whether if this should not, in fact, be required of all institutional investors to take these factors into account from a mandatory perspective and not merely a voluntary perspective. Again, the TNFD recommendations, similarly to what we were talking about in the context of IFRS or ISSB's IFRS S1 and S2, the TNFD recommendations provide for international agreement on what disclosures should be made in respect of nature. And this international agreement is very important because it allows us to take from it risks and also opportunities, but it's because of the consistency and the international nature of it, it will help to form the basis for policy and regulatory intervention in our own jurisdictions. Then to turn to the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is obviously an aspect of the EU Green Deal and something which is very complicated, and I don't tend to go into great detail, but I really would just like to flag the effect of this on African companies. So the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive expands the requirements of the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, which is the existing regulatory framework that mandates sizable public interest entities in the EU to report on their sustainability performance. And it's currently being phased in Europe. There's a related piece of legislation or directive at the same time also being developed and under consideration, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. They're both part of the EU's efforts to implement the EU Green Deal. And what do they mean for us? If the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive is adopted in its current form, it would require companies to establish due diligence procedures to address the adverse impacts of their actions on human rights and the environment. And this would not apply only to European companies. It would also include their value chains worldwide. So the effect of this would be that if an African company has a trade relationship with a European company whereby it exports either parts or constituent parts of any product that is going to be sold in the EU, then that company would need to be able to meet the due diligence questions that will be asked of it by its counterpart in the EU. And the idea behind this, of course, is to ensure that sustainable and responsible corporate behavior occurs everywhere, and to introduce, sustainability considerations throughout a company's value chain to ensure that there's no shifting outside of a regulated environment into a perhaps less stringently regulated environment. But it does mean for our companies, from an African perspective, in order to continue to be able to export, African companies will need to have the information that their European counterparts will be looking for to be able to supply that information for the reporting, and will need to be able to develop ways of collecting that information and measuring it, which perhaps was not necessarily required by our own domestic regulation. So some of the questions that we would need to consider, or that needs to be considered from an African perspective, is when these due diligence questionnaires come from European counterparts, will our African companies be able to provide the requested information? Will we have the data? Do we test the specific elements that are asked for in the questionnaire? And of course, this can apply not just to the company itself, but to sub-suppliers. So this may affect whole value chains throughout our economies. And then, of course, because the EU Green Deal is, of course, European Union, these are European Union directives, and they will then be subject to member states' own national legislation. It may be that there are varying requirements, due diligence requirements and standards that we would need to contend with. There are also potentially updates to supply agreements that need to be considered. And I think what's very important here is to ensure that no risk is unfairly passed off onto African counterparts, because, for example, clauses included in supply agreements around warranties that African companies will do all such things as may be necessary or can comply with the European or the particular member state legislation, that might be easy to sign up to, or it might be easy to slip into a supply agreement, but it's an unfair passing through of risk to companies that are not subject to that legislation. So it's something that needs a risk that needs to be managed. Finally, just to mention CBAM, and then I know there are some questions for me, which I'll turn to next. CBAM is obviously related to this European development that I've been talking about. A regulatory measure adopted as part of the EU Green Deal, and to try and ensure that the EU meets its ambition to be carbon neutral by 2050. So CBAM complements the existing carbon pricing mechanism in the EU, and the intention is to stop carbon leakage. So essentially, because there is a price for carbon in the EU, the concern is that activities should not be shifted outside of the EU to avoid having to pay the carbon price. So that is the purpose of the legislation. So obviously there's a transitional phase which has just kicked off, or we're about to enter the transitional phase of CBAM. Starts on the 1st of October and it runs until the 1st of January 2026. And during this period, EU affected entities will be required to collect data around the GHG emissions embedded in the products that they import into the EU, but they won't be required to purchase the CBAM certificates that correspond to the embedded emissions at this stage. So the first step really during this transitional period will be the collecting of information. So again, an African company exporting into the EU will need to be able to provide the necessary data around the GHG emissions embedded in the product, which it exports from Africa, from the particular country into the EU. So there are currently 6 targeted sectors, the 6 carbon intensive sectors. You can see them on the screen: cement, electricity, fertilizer, iron and steel, aluminium, and hydrogen. And this is essentially these are the sectors that will be affected. And it is companies who have interactions with businesses in these sectors who would need to be concerned about CBAM. CBAM, of course, is problematic, or problematic is the wrong word, is something for us to be concerned about in Africa, because we don't have carbon pricing in all of our, in very many of the jurisdictions in Africa. So carbon pricing is at its beginning stages in several jurisdictions. And the way that the CBAM mechanism works is that there is in order to avoid any kind of double tax, there is a credit for any carbon tax or carbon price that has been paid in the jurisdiction in which the goods were first produced before they were exported. And that price is linked, the credit is linked to the EU price of carbon. So essentially, you're getting credit for any tax you previously paid or price you previously paid. But if the goods are produced in a jurisdiction where there is either no carbon price, or the carbon price is much lower than that in the EU, then the benefit of that offset is obviously not going to shield the importer from paying a further carbon price on those goods in respect of the embedded GHG emissions. And so that could make exports less competitive and could drive a EU importer to look for a different partner, either in a jurisdiction with an equivalent carbon price, or else a partner who could produce goods without such embedded GHG emissions. So something that certainly can affect business as we know it and as we experience it today. So those were some of the international developments that I wanted to touch on that are driving the regulation and regulatory development that we are monitoring currently. I know that there were some questions, so let me go to the chat and see if I can answer those. To the beginning. Okay, so Jacob has asked, what is the largest source of capital to sustainable finance in the region, and in what vehicle is that investment made? I think that's quite a difficult question to answer. So the largest source of capital to sustainable finance, I mean, a lot of the sustainable finance inflows that we see are obviously from DFIs into the region, or from multilateral development agencies. There's quite an active philanthropic and grant community bringing sustainable finance, or be involved in at least blended finance initiatives in the region. But I'm not sure I can answer that question more definitively than that. What I can say about particularly the South African sustainable finance market is that we're seeing an increase and a ratcheting up in sustainable finance deployed by our banks in the normal commercial market. So banks have obviously been funded through sustainable finance instruments themselves, but they are now at great effort to scale up the deployment of that sustainable finance to corporate borrowers, and in so doing are driving the allocation of that capital to projects that are eligible from a green or a social perspective, or else are linking the deployment of that capital to sustainability targets, performance targets. And I think that is an important shift, because if I think maybe about a year and a half, 2 years ago, that was much less prevalent than it is now. And if we think of the other jurisdictions, I mean, Namibia particularly is, I think, at the beginning of that development journey, and is certainly looking at ways in which to mainstream sustainable finance instruments. And Mauritius actually as well is seeing an increase in interest in sustainable finance instruments and the deployment of those instruments from their financial institutions. Then the second question, secondly, in Africa, what are the most impactful ways of allocating capital? How do we ensure investments are empowering and not extractive? I think that's very difficult. What's quite interesting maybe to note there is, if you think from a South African perspective of the green finance taxonomy, the taxonomy has got obviously quite a complicated way of applying, of considering whether activities held against the standards of the taxonomy meet certain requirements to be considered compliant, taxonomically compliant or not. But one of the requirements under the taxonomy is to test whether the particular project, albeit that it may be green or it may fall in one of the other environmental objectives, actually does harm to one of the other environmental objectives. And so this is a bit of a roundabout answer to the question, but perhaps one of the ways of ensuring that investment is not purely extractive or is not good on the outside but bad on the inside is to have safeguards or parameters around the requirement for taxonomic alignment, which ensures that the investment is done in such a way that it has an impact, a positive impact, as opposed to just on the surface ticking a box. Then let me see. The South African government has not made TCFD reporting mandatory as yet, but it does encourage businesses to make climate disclosures in line with the TCFD framework. From a South African perspective, what would be the level of adoption so far, and what is the impact on the entity's governance strategy or risk management activities that TCFD can have within these areas? I think it's very interesting I think there's quite wide adoption there's quite wide voluntary adoption around making disclosures in South Africa. I think the market is quite developed in that regard. I couldn't comment on what the impact will be on an aggregated basis, but certainly what I can say is, having done some gap analysis for particular clients in particular sectors, there is a gap between even those who are quite far along their journey in terms of making disclosures in accordance with the TCFD framework or even in accordance with another voluntary framework. And whilst their disclosures are quite fulsome and put forward much of the information that one would think would be required, I think this question was raised when we were talking about this in the context of IFRS S2. I think there is a gap, and there is a bit of an analysis that needs to be done to ensure that companies are able to be prepared for any mandatory reporting requirements that come in the future. Okay, and then, given that Africa is more politically fragmented than, say, the EU, could it be the case that the African continent is at a disadvantage as it's less easy to present a consolidated view of Africa's best interests? In other words, could a siloed approach mitigate against Africa's best interests? I think that's, Peter, I think that's definitely a risk. Certainly, I think the fact that we don't necessarily have as much regional cohesion as we perhaps should means that we could have very different regulatory regimes in countries right next to each other. And I think that that is difficult for any kind of cross-border trade or cross-border investment for that matter. So I do think that an effort should be made to try and move towards a cohesive or converged position. And I also think that that's why international instruments where convergence has been achieved are useful as a starting point. And I think that does play in our favor, is that most of our regulatory development in the various jurisdictions has been based off international best practice. So there is a commonality to it. The problem is more just that we're at different stages of advance. And so there might be a disadvantage in a short-term period as we all catch up to each other. And once we catch up to each other, then hopefully there'll be some more convergence. So I hope I answered that question effectively. Okay, and then, we just lost that one. All right, so then Peter's asked another question there. How can businesses increase their human capital resources for this challenge? So much to learn and communicate. Are you finding firms are struggling? Yes, so this is a massive challenge. Even personally for myself, I find it a massive challenge trying to just stay on top of all the different developments. Also because we're not looking at one particular country, one's actually looking at both international best practice, regional best practice, and then the effects of different countries on each other and their developments in those areas. I think everybody is struggling. I don't know of our clients that we interact with. I think there's probably only one or two who are really on top of ensuring that they have the right capacity within the organization, that they've got the right capacity building activities underway, the right training. The rest are all still in that field building, capacity building stage of trying to get to grips with this challenge. So it's certainly, Peter, not just you and your firm. And then Paul, question from you. Is there a philanthropic group that anyone is aware of? As an organization, we're looking to form new partnerships to eventually donate our battery technologies. Okay, that one I don't think I can answer. Maybe someone on the group has an answer to that question of a philanthropic group that Paul could get in touch with around battery technology. And then I think there is an answer to that. Thank you for answering that. I think those were all of the questions, Damien. I think I got through the list, unless you saw any that I missed.